the UFC has a DEI problem. And yes, I am 100%, no, 1000% serious when I say that. And let me explain why. But first, for those of you who have been living under a rock, let's go over what DEI means. DEI is shorthand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And on Wikipedia, the term is described as, quote, organizational frameworks that seek to promote the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly groups who have historically been underrepresented, marginalized, or subject to discrimination based on identity or disability. DEI should be a very familiar concept for many of you who have been working in the corporate world, as the hiring practices that result from DEI being implemented lead to a more empowered and colorful workforce. Or in other words, the quality of the employees goes down the gutter thanks to the corporate HR lady with a communications degree from a small private liberal arts college thinks that it's better to hire another lesbian marketer who majored in ethnic food studies over actually competent talent with real skills. This happens because under DEI, a more qualified and competent hire will get turned down in favor for a less qualified, less competent hire who has a characteristic or background that isn't seen as often in that position, be it race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender expression. DEI is controversial because, while it does increase the number of people from these backgrounds in the roles they are hired for, due to the lowered levels of competence, the overall quality of the products or services a company or organization produces goes down. And the UFC is starting to have this problem too, but in its own special little way. And let me explain. Typically, when we think of DEI, we think of the talking points that 5.5 out of 10 early 30s liberal white women in talent acquisition with those tiny ugly tattoos give presentations about. You know, more LGBT plus individuals in management roles, more Africans in leadership positions, and of course, more women in STEM, because it's not like the entire HR department, which is made up exclusively of women, couldn't have majored in those fields, right? But in the UFC, it's a bit different, because the UFC is now very deliberately eliminating top-tier talent from one part of the world, the former Soviet Union. Notably, at the end of last year, the UFC released Rinat Firkhedinov, a 25-2-1 welterweight who is technically undefeated in the UFC, with an official record of 6 wins and 1 draw. Now, Rinat should have a loss, since his fight against Carlos Leal was one of the most egregious robberies in the history of the sport, and honestly, the Dalby fight was a bit of a robbery win too. However, the way that Rinat has been robbed of the remainder of his career is honestly even worse. Rinat wasn't the most entertaining fighter, but he won his final UFC fight with a quick and flashy KO, and that was against Andreas Gustafsson, a marauder who had some hype behind him thanks to his run outside of the UFC. In any fair world, Rinat should have been resigned to the UFC. He's not great, but he's pretty good and decently entertaining, and he's definitely around that near-ranked caliber at welterweight. But now, it's likely off to the prison known as ACA for the rest of his fighting days. The same goes for Muhammad Mokaev, who is still undefeated in his career. Sure, he wasn't the most exciting fighter or the most likable guy, but he's still an incredibly talented fighter who would have presented a tough challenge for basically everybody in the division. His last fight in the UFC was against Manel Kape, which, I'm gonna be honest, he shouldn't have won because of how badly he cheated in that fight. But still, a win's a win, and that win over Kape has aged incredibly well. And not only that, Mokaev speaks English, promotes himself pretty well, and has a noticeable fan base on social media. And yes, I am very well aware that Mokaev really pissed off the UFC staff and matchmakers, but that's something that other fighters have gotten away with in the past. If Mokaev wasn't a Russian, would he have gotten this kind of treatment as an undefeated prospect? I highly doubt it. And those two aren't the only fighters from the former Soviet Union that have been released with little to no reason. Loic Radzhabov, a Tajikistani fighter who has a win over Esteban Ribovic and went 2-2 in the UFC, was also recently released. And also, this isn't technically a former Soviet country, but rather a former Warsaw Pact country, But we also saw the Slovakian Martin Buday get cut from the UFC even though he was 7-1 in the promotion. Now, Khabib and Islam Makhachev have spoken about this issue, with Khabib saying it's unfair, and Islam saying that these fighters have to learn English and /or become more exciting. And I have to agree with both because it is unfair, but it is also true that they should learn English and fight in a more exciting way. Although, I will also say that the best way to get privileged treatment as a fighter from that region of the world is to train with Khabib. And I mean, I could give you a couple examples of this being the case. You know, there's Umar getting a title eliminator against Corey Sandhagen despite having 0 ranked wins. Unranked Ikram Aliskerov getting the opportunity to fight number 3 ranked Robert Whittaker on short notice after Khamzat Chimaev pulled out. And Islam Makhachev himself getting a title shot against Charles Oliveira coming off a win over Bobby Green. And I mean, we're already seeing how big of a push the UFC is giving John Pork, right? But anyways, my point is that if you're not with Khabib's team, if you're Magomed Ankalaev or Movsar Evloev or Muhammad Makhachev or any of these other guys from that part of the world, there's no Dagestani privilege for you. You will get overlooked when it comes to getting championship opportunities. And if you lose one too many times, well, it's back out to ACA where you'll be fighting in Kadyrov's backyard for welfare money paid for by Russian taxpayers who make gachi mixes on YouTube for a living. But now, if the fighters from the former Soviet countries are getting the short end of the DEI stick, then who are the fighters that are benefiting? And well, to be blunt, it's fighters from countries that just have absolutely 0 good MMA athletes. And as you can see in the thumbnail of this video, I'm thinking of Ibo Aslan from Turkey and Anshul Jubli from India. Around the same time that Renat Furkadinov was released, Ibo Aslan, who was on a 3-fight losing streak, announced that he signed a new 6-fight deal with the UFC. 6 fights! And mind you, Ibo Aslan is a pretty terrible fighter. He's 2-3 in the UFC, with his 2 wins coming against Anton Turkalj, who has been cut from the org already, and Rafael Sequeira, who is 0-4 in the UFC and bound to get released any day now. Aslan got destroyed on the ground by Ian Kudalaba, dominated by Billy Alakana, and most recently got put out cold by Iwo Baranoetsky. Granted, that fight with Iwo was pretty fun, but it also showed the limits of Ibo Aslan's game. All he can do is just swing in the pocket while squared up to his opponent. By all means, Ibo Aslan should have already been released. But no, he's being kept. Most likely because he's the only fighter from Turkey. The Turkish UFC fanbase is likely quite huge, and it's not just Turks living in Turkey proper, but Turks living in places like Germany and the UK, where they run their little, barbershops. The same goes for Anshul Jubli. Jubli is an abysmal, laughably bad fighter by UFC standards, or by any standards to be honest. He would get BTFO'd in any semi-major organization, be it Brave, KSW, Octagon, Ryzen, you name it. And after 2 humiliating KO losses, that would typically be enough for the UFC to be like, nope, get out of here, for any other fighter. But with Anshul, the King of Lions Jubli, he carries the hopes and dreams of tens of millions of Indian MMA fans on his back. And those Indians don't just live in India, where the UFC would not make that great of a profit off of their viewership due to the GDP per capita being comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. No, Indians live everywhere now. They live in America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Europe, everywhere. And because they live everywhere, they are able to earn salaries that make their viewership meaningful for the UFC to pursue. In contrast, due to the broadcasting rights in the former Soviet states paying very little and piracy being incredibly rampant in those countries, it makes sense that the UFC would be fine with letting those fighters go. No matter how good they are, if they don't sell tickets or get subscribers to pay up for Paramount Plus, the UFC isn't going to want to keep them around. And honestly speaking, I think the UFC is afraid of some of these fighters being too good in a non-exciting way, leading to them capturing titles and winning, but being boring about it. And I mean, we did just see that happen 3 times in 2025, so maybe the UFC is taking precautions by cutting these post-Soviet Union fighters in advance. However, personally, when I watch the UFC, I want to see the best fighting the best. Yes, it's better if it's exciting, but MMA is still a sport, and sports should be meritocratic. And in this new Paramount era, if we're going to see the most skilled fighters being cut on winning streaks, while bums from countries with absolutely zero MMA talent are kept around because of their market appeal, let's just say that my contempt for the UFC is going to strengthen greatly. And besides, if the UFC really wanted to get rid of all these top fighters from the post-Soviet countries, all they had to do is invest a bit more into their drug testing program. Oh, but wait, if they did that, then all of Team Khabib would probably be the first group to be banned permanently from the sport, so I guess that's a no-go. But yeah, that's my rant. All in all, I just want to see the best fight the best, regardless of where they come from. And hey, it's not like these guys are invincible or anything. Merab, Alex Pereira, and Kyoji Horiguchi have all proven that. And if we're going to keep fighters like Jubli and Aslan, then we should also keep fighters like Jordan Vucenic who look cool and have fun fights. But anyways, that's the video. Goodbye.